Thanks for coming. My name is Josh Laredo. I'm here to talk to you about the intersection of three of my favorite things: Python, New York, and trains. A couple of things before we get started. One is that this talk is a little bit more Gotham than Pi. I'll be talking a little bit about the tech I used here, but if you're looking for something that's going to help you once you actually get to work, you may want to consider one of the other talks. A second thing is that the code and data for this talk are currently on GitHub. If you're curious, I have the link up there. And the full text and slides of this are on my website. I also, so if you want to follow along there or catch up because you missed something because you were distracted by Twitter or you just don't want to take notes, you can check it out there. I also tweeted them out and PyGotham already retweeted it, so you don't even need to go try and find me on Twitter. You can just look at the PyGotham feed. And lastly, kind of a quick plug, I have a weekly email about the data and analytics community in New York City. It kind of tries to highlight some events in the city, jobs, some of the great posts that people in the community are putting out there. You can check out the archive at tinyletter.com/NYCDataJobs. If you're interested, you should sign up. Yeah, so that's it. So on to the talk real quick. So most of us who live in the city take the subway every day, and we've become acquainted with the decay of the subway over the last few years. But for those of you from out of town, let me give you a quick introduction to the system. The New York City subway first opened in 1904 with 28 stations. This is a picture of the construction of one of the original stations, Columbus Circle. If you've been there recently, you might recognize the curve and the track. This was taken about 4 years before the opening in 1900. Today, the system contains 422 stations, as we'd probably consider them, spread out across 23 different lines. And again, how you count lines depends on whether or not you include the Staten Island Railroad, if you differentiate between all the different shuttles or S lines, and if you differentiate between the J and Z lines, which now are effectively the same train. The system includes about 6,400 subway cars, makes about 8,000 trips a day. About 1 million miles get traveled every day across 665 miles of track. Weekday ridership in 2016 was 5.7 million people, and ridership last year, total number of rides was 1.76 billion, which makes it the 8th busiest system in the world. The map you see inside of the subway, whenever you walk into the subway, is actually a pretty accurate display of the system. Other than a general widening out of Manhattan, trains move in the direction that you see in the map. In general, the lines that go north and south are longer than the ones that go east and west, and the longest line of the system is the A train, which makes 66 stops over 32 miles of track. Unfortunately, the subway has been getting worse and worse over the last few years by almost any definition or metric you'd want to use. The MTA, to their credit, posts a number of different stats online in order to be publicly accountable for what's happening on the lines. Here's a graph of on-time performance of the lines over the last 8 years. A train is considered late if it makes it to the end of its route more than 5 minutes after the anticipated time, or if it skipped a stop. That's admittedly a really strict standard, but the performance has been really bad recently. The main IRT lines, which are the numbered trains, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, have on-time performance as low as about 30%. And one quick Python note, this chart and all the other charts made in this, that are shown in this presentation are made with Bokeh. This has been the first project I've worked with Bokeh on. It's totally fantastic. I would highly recommend using it for any type of project you're doing with Python. While the MTA, which operates the subways, as well as buses, commuter rail, bridges and tunnels, should be lauded for making the information available, it actually doesn't provide a lot of guidance for what we can do to make our commutes better. But the MTA does provide a lot of information that's updated in real time or near real time. They have a very well laid out developer page with a list of resources, and so potentially we can use it to make better decisions about when we can expect the subway to be working and when we need to leave a little extra time or a lot of extra time. One of the data sources is an XML endpoint that updates with major service change status, updated every minute. It's great for up-to-the-minute status checks, but there's no history stored in an accessible location, so it's kind of hard to say intelligent things in general about the subway system from that. Another source is the GTFS feed, which is called subway time. GTFS stands for General Transit Feed Specification, and it's Google's standard for ingesting transit data into Google Maps. The feed itself is somewhat difficult to work with since it requires data to be sent as a protocol buffer. So let me take a real quick moment to talk about that. Protocol buffers are a standard for serializing data. You could think of them as somewhat similar to XML in that the data they encode is instead of a highly specified tree-like structure. but they're much smaller since the data isn't encoded in text. It's all encoded as binary. So they're appropriate for highly concurrent applications. Unfortunately, the data is not human readable and not well suited for doing exploratory data analysis as a result. Fortunately, since Google treats Python as the first class language that it is, the Python protobuf library is part of the core protobuf project, which you can find on GitHub. And so support is extremely good. If you're considering working with the GTFS feed for the subway or for any other transit application, I'd highly recommend whenever you're doing any type of exploration, you convert all the data to JSON before attempting to work on it. However, if you do manage to get to the GTFS feed, there's still a few issues. The primary one is that there isn't a lot of historical data. The city started saving this information and kept it up for several months in 2014, but they discontinued the project. And you'll need to find the city's proto-spec if you're going to decode the information. Protocol buffers are ambiguous, and since they don't have an explicit text rendering, you need to have the spec in order to render them into text correctly. And the city has one available, but it's kind of difficult to find. But I did put it in the code for this project. But beyond that, even if you start working with the city's data, this is an excerpt from the city's GTFS feed that's been converted into JSON. That way we can see it. Their implementation is kind of wonky. Here's an excerpt. Not every train is identified in every trip. Stalled trains don't send any signal at all and kind of fall off, making it really difficult to figure out if there's an issue. You might notice if you squint at this code that the arrival and departure times are the same time for all of the trains. And also, if we're trying to do long-term historical research, the data isn't here. There was a really committed civic hacker that had a system up to pull the data and make it publicly available, but that project also stopped pulling in data and making it available after about 1.5 years. So I'm actually pulling in a lot of this data now and hoping to make it available, but I didn't want to wait 3 years before actually being able to do any analysis. Which brings me to the MyMTA alerting system. So in late 2008, MTA announced a program to send emails and text messages to subscribers about unplanned service disruptions. The program has been popular and has been maintained for almost a decade. So as a result, there's a record of every major service disruption on the subway, the bus system, the Long Island Railroad, the Metro North, and on any bridges and tunnels in and out of the city. Does anyone here subscribe to this feed or get emails or text messages from them? A few? Okay, yeah, me too. The great thing about the system is that the volume of data that's there. There have been over the last 9 years, there have been over 450,000 alerts, and they're crawlable if you poke around on the website long enough. Over 100,000 of them are related to subways. Slightly more are related to buses and the Long Island Railroad, which, as far as I can tell, are less reliable systems than the subway. And just to prove it worked, the MTA sent out a signed message whenever the program launched from the manager who was in charge of it, Chris Boylan. You can see this went out in November of 2008. And this shows the structure of the alerts, really. They have a title, they have a message body, they have a timestamp, and a system reference, which tells us which system it's referring to, whether that's the subway or Long Island Railroad. All of these, again, are online and are accessible. And actually going through the alerts when you aren't actually trying to get anywhere is really fun. As someone who's lived here for a long time, lots of stuff that I've seen and done in the city is encoded in these alerts. Most longtime New Yorkers will recognize this one as relating to the night when all the Thanksgiving parade balloons get blown up, which is also something that most longtime New Yorkers will tell you is one of the most fun things you can do in New York. Also, like you'd expect from such a large corpus, you'll see all sorts of weird and non-intuitive messages. This one's one of my favorites. I initially thought it was referring to some lesser Catholic feast or something like that, but I can't find any reference to it. So if anyone has any idea what this is referring to, I'm all ears. Probably my favorite thing about all the alerts, though, is that inexplicably all the bridge and tunnel alerts are always in all caps, which is just perfect if you're used to being in the city. So anyways, on to the Python part of this. So after I built a simple web scraper to pull down all these alerts, I went back 3 years and I started engineering a few features to help me extract which lines are impacted on each alert and whether the alert was new, if they're talking about a new disruption, or was an update on an existing disruption. or if it was talking about planned service changes or unplanned service changes. After cleaning the data, I wanted to do a quick sanity check on whether the data was any good. So I looked at the relationship between these alerts and the ground truth over the last 3 years, for which I used the on-time information that the MTA provides on their site, the first set of charts that I showed you. So this is a chart of on-time performance that the MTA announces versus the number of disruptions that we actually see in the system. The x-axis is the number of disruptions. So how many alerts we get, and the y-axis is the on-time performance as its percentages. And so I have all the letter trains at the top, and then the number trains, the IRT trains underneath it. So fortunately, and the number on each of these charts is the correlation coefficient. It's the R-squared number. So fortunately, the relationship between these variables is really strong. Across the 20 lines that have been under continuous operation, the average correlation between the number of alerts and on-time performance was negative 0.5. So as there are more alerts, we expect worse on-time performance, which makes sense. So generally, we feel pretty good about the data set. The two major exceptions to this trend were the R and the 6 trains, which required some investigation. The R train is actually pretty easy to explain. So on the left here is the on-time performance, and the right is a graph of on-time performance versus the number of alerts. Before fall of 2014, the R operated in 2 distinct sections for over a year as repairs were being made on the Montague Street tunnel. Then late last year, R service was extended to Whitehall Street, which allowed the R to avoid some problem relays in Queens. So you can pretty clearly see the impacts of the service changes in late 2014 and late 2016 on R's on-time performance. So it's very understandable why that didn't follow the general trend. I don't have as clear an explanation about why the 6 train doesn't follow the same trend. And why it's an outlier. I believe this is due to the 2nd Avenue subway line opening earlier this year, which was primarily designed to take pressure off the 6th in Manhattan. So while the rest of the system has gotten worse this year, the 6 has gotten slightly better. As someone who rides the 6 regularly, that seems like a reasonable explanation to me. An alternate hypothesis, I guess your null hypothesis here would be that no matter what happens in the system, the 6 will probably be late, which actually sounds like a pretty compelling hypothesis as well. So that may be true, but regardless, other than the R and the 6, I feel like we have a system that does a pretty good job of displaying, of understanding when trains are going to be late, or how frequently trains will be late. So looking at system-wide disruptions also gives us a nice way to measure system performance day by day. So here's a graph of day-by-day performance in terms of the average number of disruptions, and the bold line is the 28-day moving average of the number of disruptions. You can see that the chart's dominated by a general upward trend in the last year, and then some really big spikes, which after investigation are due to winter storms. It's usually big snowstorms cause a huge increase in the number of disruptions. Well, I'd love to blame the MTA for the snow. That seems pretty cruel. So at this point, we have to do a little bit of classification to pull out the trains that, or the disruptions that we think are due to weather. So I engineered a few additional features to try and get the cause of each of these alerts, mostly around key words that appeared in the alerts. And Scikit comes with a ton of classification tools. I used a decision tree on top of some of these engineered features, and then manually classified a bit over 1,000 alerts to train the model, and then validated on an out-of-sample selection. So the initial model I did, this is an excerpt of what the tree looks like. For those of you who are counting, I used a max depth of 7 and a min number of incidents in each leaf node of 5, and regular Gini coefficient splitting, and got about 97% accuracy on an out-of-sample set of alerts, and felt like that was good enough to move forward with and understand what was causing disruptions. So with this, I can take a look at the performance of the subway over the last 36 months with the impact of bad weather pulled out. Like before, this is a daily number of disruptions with the 28-day moving average in bold. We can see pretty clearly that the system has been dealing with more disruptions, jumping from an average of about 15 disruptions a day over the last few years to about 22 since late last year. So that's a roughly 50% increase in disruptions, so we aren't just imagining things, the trains really are getting worse. Also, now that we've identified weather as a driver of performance, we can see how precipitation impacts the trains. I pulled daily weather information from NOAA and regressed it against the performance. The relationship is roughly linear, and every inch of precipitation results in about 5 additional disruptions per day. Or another way of thinking about it is that the first inch of rain leads to about a 30% increase in disruptions compared to a dry day. The relationship isn't incredibly strong, but it's definitely there, and it's definitely positive in the way that we would expect. There's a much stronger relationship when looking at snow. Here we see that each inch of snowfall that comes down leads to about a 10% increase in disruptions compared to a dry day. I also took a look at the relationship between cold and hot weather on train performance. Extreme cold weather has a slight negative impact on train performance. Warm weather doesn't have any impact at all. And I wasn't able to find any other really meaningful relationships. So one other cool thing that comes out of this is that we can also now see a breakdown of all the causes of delays in the subway to a pretty high level of accuracy. So here's my obligatory Jupyter Notebook screenshot or reference. Excluding some delay types we don't care about, like non-service announcements, on an average day over the last 3 years, the system sees about 18 disruptions per day. The most common cause of these delays are general equipment problems and signal and switch problems, which I have combined together under signal. Sick customers, police activity, and maintenance make up most of the other really common causes of disruptions. If you're reading closely, you'll notice that I'm breaking out end of disruption alerts separately. Occasionally, the city will only announce a disruption that is past, so I'm classifying those slightly differently and trying to understand them slightly differently as well. Anyways, some of the nifty things we can see here are the relative rankings of how bad each disruption is, estimated by the number of alerts and updates that get sent every time we get a disruption. The MTA sends updates on open disruptions about every 2 hours. So as a very loose rule of thumb, I think of every update as representing an issue lasting for 2 more hours. You can see that construction is far and away the worst issue in terms of how long those remain open, which may be confusing, but what I mean here is road conditions impacting shuttle buses. So these are situations when you've already transferred to a bus instead of the subway, and then the bus is rerouted by road construction, which is I have some of those messages on the right side here that are selected out, which are just like the absolute worst days you can possibly have, I think, whenever you're in that kind of situation. Unplanned service changes, weather disruption, and accidents, which unfortunately usually means someone who's been hit by a train, take a long time to resolve. Getting sick customers off the system doesn't take a long time, and the police tend to move very, very quickly and try and get the trains running again as fast as possible. So finally, we're really in a place to start thinking about when we want to avoid the subway. The first thing I've looked at is when the most disruptions occur. So here's a heat map of when disruptions occur. Darker colors mean more disruptions. It turns out the worst time for the system is Monday morning between 8 and 9 a.m. No huge surprise there. Weekdays, disruptions primarily happen between 6 and 10 a.m. and between 3 and 7 p.m. in the afternoon. Fridays are by far the easiest days of the week to commute of the weekdays. Putting this data another way, on Monday mornings, there's an 80% chance that there will be a disruption somewhere on the system in any given hour. This falls to about 20% by the middle of the night. So pretty clearly, there's a direct correlation between the number of people on the system and the number of disruptions. This makes a lot of sense for certain disruption types, like sick passengers or high volume or overcrowding, but it also applies to things you wouldn't expect. So here's a chart of the hourly likelihood of equipment problems. You'll see that though we wouldn't necessarily expect equipment to always break down during rush hour, our disruption announcements come during rush hour or are announced during rush hour. So while there's some possibility that there are more trains running during rush hours, and so it would make sense that there might be slightly more, this gives me there might be slightly more breakdowns. This gives me some concern about the quality of the data, that we might be getting in data that is really biased by the selections or whenever people think it's important to actually notify everyone who's on the train. But then I think I can live with that. I mean, if a train stalls in the middle of the night and no one is on it, does it really create a delay? But unfortunately, since most of the disruptions follow a very similar pattern of being worse early in the week and in the morning, there isn't really much we can say about the relative likelihoods of delays. There are 2 exceptions, though. Maintenance windows clearly happen off hours. Even when the MTA needs to do unplanned work, they obviously strive to avoid working during peak hours. The other main exception is with sick customers. It's a little hard to see, but sick customer delays become more common later in the week, with Thursday and Friday afternoons being slightly heavier than early in the week. On Fridays, every hour from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m., there's about a 20% chance that there's a sick passenger causing a delay somewhere in the system. I'll leave it as an exercise to the audience to figure out why. And we can even go a little further and see which disruptions are likely to happen on each line. So here's a heat map of disruptions by line for the major causes of delay. While again we see some similar patterns in the data, there's some identifiable differences. Delays on the L are dominated by equipment problems, and the very similar 7 train sees the same. My 456 deals with sick passengers the most, maybe because it serves the bros of Murray Hill, which I say with love, having been one. The F train in particular suffers from signal and switch problems, while the JZ, the G, and the 1 trains seem to be pretty reliable from day to day. Probably the most interesting thing I've found so far, though, and what I'm continuing to research, is how delays cascade throughout the system, from one train line to another. Obviously, trains that run on the same line will share a lot of delays, so if there's a problem on the 4, it usually is going to impact the 6. However, in the Outer Boros, there are a lot of trains that run together differently than they do in Manhattan. As a result, from a Manhattanite's perspective at least, there's some ability to predict issues on what seem like unrelated lines. The E and the F, for instance, don't run together at all in Manhattan, but they do share a line in Brooklyn. And so fairly often when there's an issue with one of them, the other will reflect this, and they'll be disrupted not long after. And this does have some predictive power. Unfortunately, that's about as far as my research has taken me as of now. I continue to look at different ways to model expectations of delays, but I haven't really been able to do about better than 30% accuracy as measured by correctly predicting which line will have a disruption at any given hour. So it's the final irony of this work on the subway that I've spent hours on it, going nowhere and slower than I've hoped. Still, I promise to give you some advice that you can use to make your commutes better, and I do have data to give a few simple pieces of advice. If you're going to choose a day to stay home because you can't stand the commute, always choose Monday. If there's an unplanned service change, stay away from the line for the rest of the day, but stick around if there's a sick passenger or police activity, because those will resolve quickly. If you can stay home when there's more than 2 inches of rain or 5 inches of snow forecast for the day, you probably should. And definitely sign up for the MTA alerts. If you can't know about delays ahead of time, at least you can know about them in real time. Thanks a bunch for listening, and safe travels. Two questions? 2 minutes? I have 2 minutes for questions if anyone has a question. Yeah? The question is, did I see any impact from Sandy? I looked at only 3 years of data, so I think I started right after Sandy, which was late 2013. So I don't know. Yeah. The question is whether I selected how I selected texts for the classification. So I was working in pandas, as like, I'm sure you're all shocked. Pandas actually has a really nice sample method, so I randomly pulled alerts out. So it's a totally random sample. When I first ran the classification model, though, I was having trouble finding rare events and classifying rare events that didn't show up in my sample. So I did what everyone is told not to do, which is that I biased the sample and I pulled in a couple examples of those alerts in order to make sure that they were represented, so that way they're classified correctly. Yeah.
So I don't even know how to guess really. What is an unauthorized person that someone sends a message over the
Someone's walking on the tracks usually.
Oh.
Yeah, unauthorized person on the track usually. Sometimes unauthorized vehicles on above ground tracks. There have been like all sorts of crazy stories about other things that have happened. Yeah. Yeah. The question's about making them the alerts more clear. I think that's on the PA. There was an announcement recently that the transit board there are actually like a whole bunch of interlocking state and city agencies that handle transit in the city, and that one of them I think it's the New York City Transit is going to change how they report on-time analysis. They actually launched a new dashboard, which I think is a step backwards because it doesn't have as much historical data. But yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. A lot of this focus has been on advice for riders, but what about advice for the MTA or policy? I mean, transportation alternatives and things here that hopefully they care about or want. Are you talking to anyone there to improve the alerts or giving advice on what would make it better?
I guess the one thing that's come out of this for me, I certainly have opinions about transit. I think that like while I'm super stoked to take ferry rides, now that the city has ferry, like I think it's bad transit policy. I think that the mayor's idea for the BQ connection is a bad idea from a transit policy perspective. That said, like the main thing that's come out of this for me is I have like a huge amount of respect for all the crap the MTA has to deal with day to day. Seeing the list of alerts that go off every day is like stunning. And just like they are maintaining a system that has over 5.5 million riders every day with zero downtime, 24/7, 365 days a year. So I'm more like impressed with it than coming out with like smart things to say. Though I mean I have like a couple opinions about what they should do with like our service and stuff like that, but nothing that would move the needle that much, honestly. Yeah.
I was wondering if you, over the course of this, like, what are the data sources that are available in addition to alerts? You mentioned, like, station performance, like, is there data sources, even scribbling ones for, like, timing systems on the trains? Like, what is out there?
Yeah, so all the timing systems, like the countdown clocks in the train, work off of the global transit or the general transit feed specification. I say it so many times, I've gotten it mixed up. So they pull off of that like real-time protobuf data field. I think I covered most of the ones that I know about. The MTA does have a few extra numbers that they use to judge on time or judge their performance, like weight assessment, which are really unintuitive. I think that, but most of them are listed on the MTA site, which is actually pretty good. They make developer keys are easy to get with like pretty easy or loose kind of restrictions and rules of usage. So the stuff is there. It's just kind of hard to parse. Is that good? Okay, great. Thanks a lot, everybody.